Good morning.
Good
Hi, Anar.
morning.
Hi, Prab. I'm very
Hi
excited
everyone.
to be in conversation with you this morning. I'm Georgina, and I'm the Assistant Director for Research and Assessment at the Swear Center for those of you watching us. As part of my work, I have the immense privilege of working with amazing graduate students that help us continue to infuse our work with critical scholarship, advocacy connections, and multidisciplinary perspectives. And two of them are here today so that we can have this community conversation reflecting on this past year. So, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself, Anar?
Yeah, sure. Hi Georgina. Hi Prab. It's good to see you outside of our normal weekly meeting time. I'm Anar Parikh, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology, and I've been a graduate student fellow at the Swear Center for the past 2 years. Prab?
Hi, I'm prabhdeep Singh Kehal. I am a sixth year PhD candidate in sociology here, and I am starting to wrap up now my third year in the SWER Fellowship for Graduate Community Fellows, and we'll be continuing on with Anar into our fourth year. So very excited to be here with you both today.
So this fellowship, the Graduate Fellowship in Community Engaged Scholarship, um, was something that we rolled out 3 years ago now, 4 years ago now. And would you tell me a little bit of like what interested you in the fellowship when you saw the announcement?
Yeah, I can go
Remember?
first.
Go ahead,
Yes.
Prab.
I was really interested in the fellowship. It was forwarded to me by one of my committee members when it was announced. And it was a little bit of their confidence of like, this seems like something that you would be interested in, because I hadn't worked with Swear, really heard of Swear up until that email, really. Um, and I applied because it was one of the few places, I think still today on campus, where you can actually study the institution of higher education. And what I mean by that is a lot of times we study universities and sort of what happens within them, how students and faculty and staff experience things, but we don't often think about the university and how it occupies space. And that was something very specific that SWER is focused on, and that the fellowship provided an opportunity to actually think about the other part of my own work, which is what do universities do to their surrounding environments, and in what ways does that make things better? And in what ways does that actually make things quite worse? And Swear provided the fellowship provided an opportunity to delve into those questions while working with the people who are saying, hey, university, you're making things better. Hey, university, you're making things worse. So that's sort of what drew me to it. It brought together both research skills and an opportunity to work with the people that, we spend so much time talking about.
Um, yeah, and I think I came at the fellowship from a slightly different perspective. So I was away from Brown for about 2 years doing my dissertation fieldwork. And as an anthropologist, I was doing ethnographic fieldwork, but I did a lot of I was doing a lot of engaged research while I was doing my ethnographic fieldwork. So I was working as a civic engagement coordinator at a nonprofit organization while also doing interviews and participant observations for my research on immigrant political participation in the US. And so as I was coming back to campus, I was looking for a way to stay connected to the community engagement piece of my work and to expand it beyond just the field work that I was doing for my project and think about what are the other components of that, like as Prab mentioned, thinking about higher education and institutions, and then also what I'm working on now in terms of how to integrate principles of like reciprocal and mutually reciprocal engagement into undergraduate community engagement service learning curriculum. So I was interested in kind of expanding beyond my single project. So yeah.
And then on your side, Georgina, when you were soliciting or making the ad for the position, what was Swearer's sort of, or I guess since you're the supervisor, what was your thinking about what you hoped for the position to be?
So the fellowship at the time was part of kind of a graduate student engagement strategy to expand our ability to engage with graduate students and also build kind of structured opportunities for you to be involved. There's always opportunities for grad students to be involved in direct service through our community core programs in different areas that they might be interested in. But there wasn't really a space for you to connect your kind of research work with the type of work that we do, whether you're doing community-based research or you're interested in higher education in your case, Prab, or working around kind of activism or advocacy, which is kind of where Anar is coming from. So we were hoping to kind of build that space. And at the time we were launching a research initiative that was thinking specifically about community engagement in higher education more broadly as a research project nationally and internationally. And how do we think about what does reciprocity mean, right? Like how do we unpack those things that we use all the time when we talk about our values, but what do these really mean in practice? Um, so this was kind of one of our very structured ways of doing that, through learning about these proctorships and being able to raise the funds to enable us to have this long-term partnership. And I think we had hoped for it to be a long-term partnership without knowing what the students' kind of experience would be, or what it would look like in practice. But I was very excited that we were able to retain you for multiple years through it. And I think that was kind of that aspect of it to me. And I can ask about that to you specifically, of like, what did it feel like with this kind of more longer term engagement between year one or year two, or like how did that change with your experience?
Yeah, I'll talk about that. And I think honestly, the longer term engagement has been one of the most rewarding sort of parts of this experience. And I, both as an anthropologist and my own sort of the way that I learn, is really grounded in taking a lot of time to understand things, and like really building on experience over time in order to feel comfortable in a place. And like, and I think that's somewhat counterintuitive to how we often think about productivity in our sort of capitalist, hyper-productive world. But I think the first year definitely felt like a kind of acclimatization process of really understanding what the center was about, and what are the different types of work that are happening. And then the second year has been really more about, and I was working on a project that was more individual based rather than collaborative with other staff and folks who work at the center. Whereas this year, I've really been able to work not just collaboratively with Prab and Georgina on our research and assessments team, but also with the student development team, and also in conversation with the community partnerships team. So that, I think that has been made possible by the longer term engagement, and kind of like really familiarizing being able to familiarize myself with the center, and then also build relationships with the other people who work there.
And the only thing I'll add to that, because though my first and second year were a little bit different project-wise than Anar was when she came in next, I think, so I had a bit of a break between my first 2-year session and now this finishing up this 2-year session. And in addition to what Anar was suggesting and saying that was really helpful, Georgina, your word of retaining, I think, is the very important missing language in a lot of things that people would roll out in universities for multi-year projects. So we know for a fact that even if faculty are hired, so this touches on my own work, when we know that faculty who are from marginalized backgrounds are hired, even the reason they often leave or do not stay is because of retainment issues. And that doesn't begin when they're hired as faculty. It begins when they're hired as graduate students and as graduate worker employees. And having the opportunity to both be part of something new and developing. So working with the people who are my supervisors to figure out what was the project that we wanted to do. How does it match not only my interests, but also how is it beneficial to the people who are supposed to benefit from this? So actually having those conversations, which are not necessarily the ones that are rewarded within academic disciplines, I think actually expands our imagination and it helps us reground ourselves in the reality of our world rather than our perception of the world. Both of those matter, but I would rather be grounded in the reality than in the perception because it gives us a way to work with the reality and the perception. And being able to work with someone like Georgina and the folks at Swear, like having the multiple year infrastructure of actually feeling like you're being invested in, like every year is a growth, every year is something about thinking differently about like you're at a next stage of your career, right? And that's not something that PhD programs do very well. And I'm not talking about here specifically, I mean in general. The structure of graduate education is not one where you think of yourself as progressing with increasing knowledge and training. It's one where you sort of hit checkpoints and you hope by the end of it, you've hit all the right checkpoints to make it to the next jump. So that was a really wonderful thing about the multiple year element was that you felt like you were being invested in because you were.
And I would add that, thinking about the last year, that that investment and also staying on to something rather than like starting something new made adapting to this year if this I wouldn't say easier necessarily, but it definitely facilitated a kind of like being able to move into the role and feel comfortable with the work even while all these other changes are happening, or even while we were adapting to the remote words are hard these days, but even while we were, that is an insight from the past year, but even while we were adapting to the remote model and really kind of getting used to how things would look, feeling like there was a space that had an investment in us as graduate students, and also shifting from one year to the next, and that kind of continuity made that adaptation process much more friendly, I think.
Yeah, I could definitely feel the difference from between kind of people I know and I've built a relationship with versus newer folks whom I've been trying to kind of build that virtual connection with without maybe having met before, or so it's definitely feels like I don't need to kind of do the introductions, and in your case all the onboarding and all the getting to know Swear and the positionality within the field and what is the field. It's pretty much news to a lot of graduate students that there's actually journals and conferences and associations where you could present on this work outside of your discipline. And yeah, this is not just saying it to your faces, but to everyone watching. This is actually one of my favorite meetings that we have every week. I feel like we've really managed to build a learning and collaboration community, and the virtual aspects of it, it actually worked in a way. I can't complain about any challenges that I personally have had with this partnership in specifically kind of in adapting it to our virtual realities now. So, I mean, I definitely miss our impromptu lunches or seeing what Anar is picking up from the fridge and having a conversation about plates and our backgrounds and our families, or just kind of coming in and saying hi. So that definitely we miss that aspect, especially kind of having all kinds of connections that are just, we don't have to schedule, right? Just kind of meeting in the kitchen or hanging out. Prab wasn't with us last year, so we didn't have a ton of those, but we did before. Yeah, so I feel like that fact of it being a continuity also definitely helped us transition better this year. What was your experience, Prab, especially that you weren't on site with us last year and kind of transitioned into this virtual collaboration?
So it's really funny because even though I wasn't in the role, I haven't actually geographically moved. So I've been in the same place, just changing positions. But I think the biggest thing for me in sort of adapting in this past year, and I think it does have to do with our work, but I don't think the reason I'm pointing it out is because I think we don't notice it enough. I noticed that in our conversations, in addition to talking about our work and noticing whether it was plants around us or thoughtfully engaging with what you are learning about your friends' and your colleagues' home environment, right? The other thing was that there was a lot of moments where we had to talk to each other about how to advocate for ourselves. and that's not to say that we weren't doing that before, but it took on a different level of urgency and a different scale. And that was something that we had to add into our work, which I think, given the context of a sort of nonprofit professional environment, the academy nonprofit sort of collegiality environment, in those sorts of things, we have a lot of autonomy to do things, but we don't often think that we have autonomy to do things, yet we severely constrict it. And part of that is because of our imagination. So in actually having to make advocacy, self-advocacy a part of our work, I think it actually made me much more invested, and I didn't realize that this was possible, even more invested in making sure that whose interests were being guarded in our work and whose interests were being explored and invested in. So in some sense, the way that I was being treated wonderfully by you made me then think about, and by our collective, made me think about, like, this should be the norm. Is this being embodied in our work and in the way that we work with others? Yeah, so that was definitely an adaptation in both of, I think, our personal and professional lives.
And just, I don't know if we like really explained what our model looks like right now, but Georgina, Prab, and I meet once a week, every week on Thursdays, and do a weekly check-in. And then in addition to that, when we're meeting with other teams at Swearer, or if there's other things to check in about on the respective projects that Prab and I are working on, then we add those into the week. But that Thursday meeting time is really consistent, and it's a time to share and brainstorm, and also just check in on how things are going. And I think similarly in all of the various nonprofit and academic contexts, I think this year is the first time that type of meeting has been really a consistent thing that we've like intentionally held on to, because I think it can also be, you can have a standing meeting, but it can also be really easy to let the standing meeting go if something else comes up. And obviously there is flexibility, but for me, having that check-in has been like, oh, this is a model of like what mentorship and collaboration can look like in a professional slash, it's a weird professional slash academic space, but and again, as Prab was saying, how to model that across a variety of spaces, not just at Swearer, but in our community partnerships, in how we do student programming, also in other work environments. I think I've been learning a lot from how we've been building a kind of like a relational approach to doing this work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the other like element to me, in addition to everything you're saying, is also like through this fellowship, you get to interact and engage with staff in a way that graduate students don't. Most graduate students engage with staff at the university in a very transactional, administrative way that's often filled with frustrations about payments or delays or like whatever it is. Usually there's like it's just a very different relationship. And to me, I also want you to know what happens in the background, like what happens when a payment is delayed, what else is on our plates. And like there's kind of like so many different aspects of how we actually function administratively, but also the all kinds of different pathways you can take in the academy that aren't just faculty and faculty roles or other kind of roles that we're mostly steering our students into in general as a research university, obviously. But in terms of kind of being a PhD and like in a different role, or just learning what are other spaces if you choose to become a faculty member, who can you collaborate with, and who are thought partners, and who are knowledge producers. And for us, we're kind of pushing that to like expanding that to staff, but also expanding it beyond the gates of the university altogether, and really engaging you in thinking about community partners as part of that knowledge production, and that kind of to bi-directional way that in many cases the partners have more expertise in many topics, especially the topics that you're kind of interested in. And I don't think it was specifically news to you because you have had that background, but I think to many of our graduate students, that's sometimes the first time they get to interact with like a knowledge producer or a staff member that does things that are also research based, or that community partner infusing your research in different ways. So I think that that's also kind of a way that this collaboration can also help you think about higher education altogether, and also like nonprofits or other spaces, and really thinking about whose voices do we usually uplift and put on a pedestal, and why, especially within the context of equity and anti-racism. Like, what have we done, and why did we do it, and how can we do it differently? So, and in no way am I saying that we're like the model to do that work. We're just trying. We're taking baby steps towards that, but it definitely starts with figuring out check-in conversations, and trickles up, right? Like it takes place in every one of the spaces that we build together, and every one of the products that we collaborate on. So um yeah,
Yeah,
do you
and
yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say that reminds me of like one of the things that I think that was a very exciting, or something that I was very happy that was a part of our work at this past year, um, was the fact of building in experimentation. So for managers, it's very scary sometimes. It's very scary for them, usually, always, when they don't know who the people, quote unquote, below them are doing all the time, right? And I think with a lot of the work that we're trying to do, we're trying to, because we're trying not to use the normalized ways that things operate, because we know that they cause issues, trying to build an alternative that is actually um, in line with the people that we're trying, that are community partners, means actually destabilizing our own expectations. And I don't think, I mean, I think our work has been really helpful in both myself in practicing that and what that looks like with deadlines and with management, but also like what you were saying about knowledge production. Knowledge production does not happen in a linear fashion, and respecting the interactive way that like I learn from you and you learn from like the community partner meetings, and that comes back to me, and then how that then goes back into the literature, and how what that informs what I pull out to bring back to the the partners. Like that's the knowledge production process. It's not me writing up the ideas in my brain to a document and giving it to them for them to follow. So that's something that was really, really impactful for me this past year, of learning how to experience that in my work, but also like how that's necessary to actually do the work in a to do the work.
And I mean, I think it's and also having the weekly meetings has been a way to really highlight how that's incremental and cumulative. And also, so one of my previous, or like what my previous mentorship or supervisory kind of like dynamics have involved is really a lot of self-directed work, and then a check-in as necessary with like big deadlines for a project, without the kind of like steps in between, or without the check-ins or steps in between to see what's like, what do you need to, like, what are the various pieces that make up a big project, like reviewing the co-curriculum or something like that. And every week the work, we try to have something that is on our to-do list for the week, or a work product, but I found that looks really different from week to week, right? Like one week it could be a draft of the memo, but on another week it could be just thinking through or talking through what are the things that I've like thought about during that week. And those are both necessary parts, among others, of what doing a project or doing work looks like. And so that's something that I've like really been able to kind of focus in on, as like identifying those steps, and not in any formal way, but just kind of seeing what those various steps can look like. And I think it's like surprising to say that like it's been a fun, or like a kind of like generative work experience during this time when everything feels really hard, and like work especially feels hard, but being able to have that time and space while also like really meeting concrete goals has been very rewarding.
And I think especially thank you for sharing that, Anna. I think especially the types of projects that you're involved in this year are really helping us glue our different kind of work streams together in a way that's very productive and that's helpful because we're virtual, right? Like, as opposed to me like walking into Kate and Jesus's office and asking a question, or like there's just so much kind of easier collaboration that we had before. I feel like through the type of work that you're doing, we're also able to kind of talk about things in a different way. Like I talked to Jesus about the guide that you worked on and got his input around like what are we missing in terms of the integration with academic content, for example, and got that perspective and brought that back. But if we were just having a conversation about like how do we integrate the two streams of the co-curriculum and curriculum, that just feels like a broader thing. So using your kind of your work product as a way for us to have that conversation also enabled us to communicate and collaborate in a kind of a smoother way as well, in really thinking about these integrations. And the same thing kind of happens in our weekly meetings where kind of right now one of you is really focused on student development and one of you is really focused on community partnership, but in both projects we're connecting to the engaged scholarship team, and in both projects you're also talking to each other. And so while like our teams are talking to each other, you're also coordinating. As I think about training needs for the students from the partner perspective, I think you should think about that element, because that's kind of your your plate this year, and I'm going to think about the student side of things, and then like how does that play out in our connection. So that's definitely something that I feel, whether through your review or whether through Prob's kind of thinking about community impact metrics, which has been a project that is being led by our community advisory board. Like how do we kind of put these pieces together, especially in this kind of challenging year virtually, but also in a leadership transition at the center. So we are kind of gearing up with excitement for our new executive director. So really thinking about what are some elements that would be very helpful in the next stage of our strategic planning. And I think your projects, I'm sure you heard from our team how valuable they are, but will really help us get up to speed to prepare for that process, hopefully starting mid-May with Mary Jo joining us.
And what are you sort of looking forward to moving into from the lessons we learned this past year? Maybe not looking forward to, but what do either of you feel a bit more on sure foot moving forward into for this next year, since we will still be together?
We just got a note today for the staff to fill out kind of what would a post-COVID transition look like, and I'm excited to think with you about what that might look like for you and how can we kind of build a similar flexibility, and like what are some things that we learned this year that we could continue to implement. I think again this was a challenging year in so many ways, but this collaboration hasn't been, or I don't think, I mean, in whatever way we define productivity, I feel like you've been you've been very productive, even if we don't want to hold ourselves to those measures in a pandemic year. But so I feel like I'm excited to think about what kind of going back to our quote unquote regular life could look like, but also kind of how can we think of similar projects that balance our needs and your interests and think about that scaffolding in this longer term engagement, right? Like in terms of really your thoughts earlier about kind of thinking about the next year as growth, like what are some ways in which we can deepen the work now that you know what you know, and that now that you've produced what you've produced, and then kind of build on that. And I think to me, I'm very excited about deepening our collaboration with the community advisory board, and I think that is a long-term project anyway, so that will happen next year, and really thinking about the connections to equity and anti-racism in a more robust way. What are you excited about?
I can very quickly say, so something that was really cool to work on. So when I first began this position, I began it with Kaden Wilsey, who graduated and was a fellow. Hi, Kaden. Was a fellow for 2 years with me as well. And one thing that we ended up being able to write was a piece about community engagement in the context of social innovation and social entrepreneurship. And one thing that was really evident to us was that in every sort of new thing that the university wanted to do around any sort of engagement, there was always this necessity to benefit, in the sense that like there was the universities are always open to doing things as long as it doesn't hurt whatever their quote unquote central core is, whether that's their bottom line, whether that there's some sort of academic principle, something central to them, or the way that they do. So one thing that we wrote that first year was about how, and joining the chorus of other scholars, about epistemologically decentering the university. And what that just means is that it's not about the university all the time just because the university has the money. And that's a very hard lesson and a principle for both academics and folks who work on universities to internalize, because it means that they're working for not themselves and not for their employer. So what I'm interested about is continuing. I've sort of been able to play with that in every sort of project that we've worked on, whether collaboratively or individually or through conversations. And it's been really interesting to see how that translates into policy in different ways. You start seeing the shifting away in small incremental ways, but moving towards a larger vision. So I'm really excited to see how that, and our work around community partnership metrics and their own, that's why they're generating them, is part of that practice of we should not be the ones assessing whether or not we did a good job in helping you, because we're supposedly helping you and we might have actually caused the need for help itself. So it's a bit egotistical to say that we then know what's best. So that's what I'm looking forward to, is like continuing to develop that, not just critique, but that practice of what that looks like individually and organizationally.
Yeah, and actually, when I started, I read a proof of that article that was like among the
onboarding packet.
Yeah, that was in my onboarding packet as kind of like an introductory reading, and that particular line has also really stuck with me. And even in my first year, I was looking at some of the responses to the Carnegie Community Engagement Classification applications and how people responded, and that was a salient theme, especially in terms of the feedback that institutions gave of how the application asked for community partner responses, and it was like a alarm bell or something, like epistemologically decenter the university, or when we look even at student co-curriculums or the undergraduate co-curriculum that I'm working on this year, I think again, epistemologically decentering the university and the students who attend the university when thinking about service learning, right? So, I feel really right online with Prab and thinking about what that looks like in a variety of ways, both in kind of like creating, like writing, and also in praxis. So I'll plus one you on that.
How would you describe this position to people who might be interested in it? We're not recruiting this year, but we might be, and since this will be on YouTube somewhere, maybe we can get your input on it.
I think I was reflecting on how to answer this question, and I think what is surprising to me is really how broad, or like how much room there is for a variety of ways that we think about community engagement, right? And like therefore, and then connecting that to grad students who may be interested in this position, like I think we kind of know abstractly that there are a range of ways that we can think about community engagement in our scholarship, and I think that there are ways to explore all of those different ways in this position, and ones that we haven't considered before, right? So I think that is really what makes it an exciting thing to kind of pursue or to be a part of, because there's ways to continue thinking about questions that you've already been thinking about, while also I think I was actually really pushed to think about community engagement in, exactly what Georgina was talking about in the beginning, that there's this entire field of higher education that is around community engaged scholarship, that's not particularly tied to the kind of liberal arts and science disciplines that I come from. So that combination of continuing to explore what's interesting, but also being pushed to go beyond whatever the narrow conception is in our academic research that we're being trained for, is really a good thought and practical exercise for, exploring different ways to think and work.
Yeah, I will echo that entirely, probably say similar words, just very briefly, in the sense that, like, sort of what we were talking about earlier, if you're willing to be experimental in your sociological, social science work, then I would say the position is probably something that will appeal to you. Because if you're trying to be experimental, that means you're necessarily pushing against the bounds of your disciplines. And that should be something that's rewarded. So if you're someone who feels constrained in the work that you're doing or the discipline that you're doing, for whatever reason, there's probably something in this position, in this fellowship, that will, like I said earlier, it expanded my imagination in ways that I wasn't expecting. So I can only imagine that if you're actually feeling constrained, how that might be freeing to remember as we say in organizational sociology, an institution is an inhabited institution, but as academics, we're often taught that it's not inhabited or only inhabited in a particular way. So I think the position opens you up to work with people and do types of work that's locally grounded. And I think that is something, if you are trying to create local connections in a supportive way that's not transactional, this is something that can be for that.
Well, thank you both. That's our time today. Thank you so much for doing awesome work, and I look forward to centering the community and equity and anti-racism with you in the next year.
Thank you.
Have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you. I'm
Thank
hoping
you too.
supervisor like you moving forward. Biggest takeaway of the past year.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.